Welcome to a world without builds, extensible ESM modules. I'm your host for today, Erik Isaksen. You can find me on Twitter at @eIsaksen, or you can check out my podcast with Danny Blue and Amal Hussein called the Web Platform Podcast. Moving along, today we're going to look through applications versus components. So large-scale applications in this talk is what I'm really talking about, mostly versus UI component builds. And leveraging ECMAScript modules to offset some of this complexity and overhead, and how ECMAScript modules may change how you develop in the future. So what are ES modules? Quickly, since most developers who have been working with JavaScript are familiar with these, but may not know a few things about them, that how you can leverage them natively in the browsers, I'm going to quickly show you some code in here. So if I go to something like, I have an import keyword and an export keyword for these. So ECMAScript modules, or ESM modules, or ESM, ES modules, whatever you want to call them, they have a .js or a .mjs. .mjs is more for the server, but browsers that are modern will understand the .mjs as well, so you could use either one. I prefer to use the MJS just so it's consistent. And then in the browser, I have a script tag, which will render like a type equals module, so that the browser knows this is a module, and then it'll take the MJS or the JS file and pull that in. And then we have this no module thing, which basically says if I'm a modern browser, I'm going to ignore this script. If I'm not a modern browser, which won't open this other script type module, I'm going to load this file. And this is an ES3 compatible JavaScript code. So you don't have to add this in. You can get rid of it, and then just nothing will load, which is fine for some things. And we'll take a look at the different types of these. So we have an import and export keyword, like I said. So on something like helpers here, I'm importing something or all things. In this case, it's template from template.mjs, which is a relative path to that file. Now, this is a static one, so it's going to be synchronous. There are asynchronous ones, which work like promises. So in that case, I have our main file, which is page header, MJS. This is a component for a page header. I have an async function. And then inside of there, I have await import this. So everything after this is going to load. So most of us may know what this is, but maybe you don't. So I just want to make sure that everyone's on the same page. Okay. And here's where all the helpers get pulled in, same way, asynchronously, so as a promise. And then everything after this is basically in your dot then. So now go back to this. So applications versus components. So today we're using applications, hundreds, thousands of pages. We have lots of code that's codependent, intertwined with itself, complex patterns of tooling, massive state and structure. So we use great tools like MobX, maybe Vuex to handle this type of state. And we have lots of stakeholders, lots of requirements. So this thing is alive, it's out there, and it's huge. So changing things can be really scary. When we look at components that are shared, right, there's a lot of complexities with these too. Usually we're using a framework to build these out, like React or Angular, trusting in those things. And then we have a complex micro application maybe, or micro framework to load in these shared type of things. So, if you need an icon, hey, let's just load in this micro framework, or micro front end, as they're called sometimes. And then, sharing for a lot of these complex components can be limited by design choices. A lot of times the frameworks will have their own prescribed way of doing things, which may or may not be the right way for what you're building. So sometimes these components that are shared in here, you could have partial solutions, and then you have to build something else to fix it. Maybe it solves something else that you didn't plan on, but not the thing that you planned on. So there could be some weird stuff happening. Usually this requires a good amount of developer time and investment, and you're duplicating a lot of stuff in here. So the status quo for these sort of things, you use NPM, load in your dependency management. You use transpilers, TypeScript, Babel. Use builders like Webpack, Rollup. testing stuff. You're using Karma, or you're using Jest with Enzyme, whatever. And then you have types. And all of these tools are amazing. TypeScript is great. I love it. Don't typically use it for components, but I think it's great. I use it on applications all the time. Transpilers, they're great tools. I think, though, that we should look at these and say, this is the status quo now. Moving forward, how do we want to use these things? We want to really look at it and say, I'm going to make this very simple, basic, and then as I need things, I'm going to add on to that. And that's kind of where I'm going with this. So I have a page header example, which we briefly looked at. So I'm going to go back to that real quick. This is a 25-minute talk after all. And so we'll go in here and we'll just take a look at, hey, I am using very few dependencies. So you'll see in here, my dependencies are, let's take a look. When was the last time you saw this? So my dependencies are 0 for runtime. And I have, basically a compressor to convert to Brotli or gzip, depending on what I need. And then a server, so I can run my tests and so I can run my example, my demo. That's all I have, right? And so basically when I do run start, it compresses everything and then serves it. Simple. I have my index file. I can take a look, play around with it, and see what happens. And here it is. Here's my component. Very simple. Okay? I have partials in here that get loaded into my main file. And so we can look at that. This is the main file. Whenever I'm on a server, I don't run any of this code because UI components, especially web components in this case, they don't run on the server, right? So I don't need to have that stuff on there. And you might be saying, well, it's not compatible with server-side rendering. It is actually, and I'll show you why. So we have all of this stuff in here. Imports, right? And then after that, we're going to define our element and we're going to put it in. And this basically is a check. If it exists, hey, don't register it with the document. Just, to check on that. And then we have a constructor which sets up everything. A connected callback, which, if you're familiar with these sort of things, runs after. When I say these things, I mean web components in particular. This runs after it's been injected into the DOM. And then we attach some shadow root into here. And the shadow DOM, for those that don't know, I'm sure people have heard of it by now. The shadow DOM is basically a document fragment, but it's a special type of one that's been used in the web for a while, but now it's recently been exposed, right? I say recently, I mean the last 5 or 6 years. And the shadow root provides encapsulation. We've never had that before in the DOM. And so this is similar to if you have a select element. The options in there. You have access to those options, those option elements, but they don't really exist there. You can do things to them, but they're actually injected into the component in a certain spot. And that's what these slots are. And this helps with encapsulation, and surprisingly, I found it helps with getting your content seen by Google. And I don't do this at CARFAX, caveat. This is something that I propose for different companies. But I propose you look at the content that you have and what is really relevant and expose that inside the component. Because if we were doing server-side rendering, which we do have at CARFAX, we do have a few server-side rendered applications. Well, how do we handle server-side rendering? We need to load on the page, so we have an HTML snippet, which is ginormous, which gets put in, and then this is the standard approach for this, and that's a lot of overhead to manage and change, because every time you do something change to that component, then you have to update that particular HTML snippet. And so it can be, like I said before, when you're making these components, it can be very frustrating that you have to do so much extra work on top of it. So we're going to eliminate all that work. We have a custom event here. We're utilizing native APIs. And basically, this is it. simple CSS, simple JavaScript, and I have helpers in here for specific things for this component. So, for rendering, for checking the selectors, for going through the state, updating the person who's logged in, and I'm observing some pieces in the document. So it's pretty straightforward. This is open source. I'm going to share the link with you guys. And I have some templates here, which basically is the HTML and CSS that gets injected. Okay, we're using template strings for this, and I have a VS Code plugin that helps to identify this so that it's easier to edit. You don't have to use this, but I just put it in so it makes it less obnoxious when you're looking through giant strings. And it's ES6 or ES string HTML and ES string CSS, I believe, are the two. Okay, and so I'm going to go quickly back to our slideshow here. So let's present from here, and you can see there's some challenges with dealing with SEO content. So like I said, we inject this giant thing of HTML, which will need to be updated every time we change something in the component, which is frustrating. Document DOM size. So React, typically you'll have developers who add divs and spans everywhere. It's not the case at CARFAX, I don't say that loosely, but I do find that there's a lot of excessive DOM elements. So definitely we want to use semantic HTML and smaller DOM size. Browser compatibility, now we're going to use nomodule and modules to do that. We're not going to use a transpiler to make sure that everything is, backwards compatible. We're just not. And flexible code, so we have those slots. Anything that we need to inject into our component, whether it's for customized event handlers, or we need to have SEO content, some accessibility requirements, things like that, we're going to put slots in for that, because that's going to make it so that it's server-side compliant. So the plan, ESM design approach. We're going to strive for 0 runtime dependencies. So you can have like little micro libraries or something if you want, extra components that are small, but you try to strive for as few dependencies as possible. We're going to have no module fallback. That's going to, as we said, take care of our browser compatibility. Bare bones developer tooling, simple URL-based versioning, we'll talk about that, and testable and measurable pieces of code. No polyfilling, that's for the app to decide that uses this. And also, we're going to distribute to CDNs. And in our case, via NPM, unfortunately, but it's the easiest way in this case for this demo. And I'll talk about other ways to do it. So we're going to build out UI components with extensible design, performant and secure, SEO friendly, accessible. We're going to leverage native web APIs, HTML and CSS, vanilla JavaScript. Our utilities and helpers are going to have single purpose, hopefully. Functional design so we can test them easier, and they're going to utilize vanilla JavaScript. Now on that list, one thing that stands out is extensible web components. So web components, as I said, are UI components that use native browser APIs like custom elements and also Shadow DOM. And that's where this comes in with the extensibility. We can utilize Shadow DOM to create extensibility for these web components that really don't have it. And so web components render as a span, basically. If nothing works, if JavaScript fails, or if something happens, let's say one API is not supported, then it's just a span. And most people have designed in the past, I should say, components that don't utilize these slots specifically for content, or if you needed custom event handling, accessibility, acceptable fallbacks for this in HTML. So this is a way you can do that. So let's look at the HTML for this that gets put in. So I'm gonna go here, up here, go back to our repo for a second. We'll go back to the browser. This is the HTML that renders on the browser and the server. So if I'm in an SSR application, none of the JavaScript loads because of that check I do for window is undefined. You exit. So This still loads though as long as you put it into your static page or your SSR HTML that gets sent over the wire. So what I've done here is I've created slots, and the slots are injected into the component in specific spots, targeted for that. And then, for instance, a skip link will get hidden, but through accessible means, not by visual. So it's visually hidden, in other words. And the user won't be available, whatever, because it's an attribute, not recognized really, but the anchors are still going to be there. So even if I turned off JavaScript, this is still going to work. So let's test that. Let's go into the browser and see. So you might be saying, how does that work? Or you might not be. Let's take a look. So I'm going to go up here. I have a server running. So it's on localhost 5000 / index test. This is the testing, so we just want index in this case. So hold on a second, just to show you. We'll go back to those tests in a minute. All right, so I've got a little content issue loading, but you can see in this demo, I have JavaScript on right now. This is the standard stuff. If I wanted to, I could show you when it does the media query. This goes in here, so you get an idea of what the page header actually does. We just looked at the code, we haven't really seen like what it does in the browser. If I wanted to, I can go in here and say, if I don't have to really handle any logic for this, if I just take the user out, hey, nobody's logged in. Let's just go back to that default. This is great. So let's turn off JavaScript and see what blows up. Bam. Well, CSS will still work, but hey, look, we got some content. And that's because we added those slots in. We still get anchors. This is basic HTML, but we don't think about this in design all the time. So we need to design our components to be like this, like extensible, so that we can have fallbacks in any browser, even if we don't use nomodule. So I'm going to put this back before I blow up something I don't want to blow up, but you get the idea here of where we're going. And I will show you now the test stuff that I showed by accident there. It's just so we could see. These are the tests I have for unit tests. So this tests all of the stuff in the for the templates. This tests for the utils and any helpers and things like that. And this is just using standard. It's not using state-of-the-art stuff. It's just QUnit, which is the jQuery testing framework. It's just 2 files, a CSS and a JavaScript file. And I can show you that here. This is all this is, and there's my test files. Very simple. And the tests you can see in here, they're very functional. Like I have something that returns something, and I assert that something is in there, part of that content, and we're off to the races. Very simple to do. So I have here the documentation where I show how to load through Skypack or through Unpackage. And so what I did was I set up, for purposes here, an npm module so that we could distribute these automatically or automagically to different CDNs. And so cdn.skypack.dev, just released recently, has some interesting features that Unpackage I'm not sure is going to be handling in the future, but basically optimizing for performance and doing possible versioning on there. I'm not 100% sure on how that would work, or if it's something that's on their map, but it's very interesting possibilities that you could do with Skypack and Unpackage. So in Unpackage, you would do it this way, where let's say you wanted to have this, you publish to npm, and now you want to use your script module to load in your component or your nomodule component. I'm going to copy this URL so you could see what it looks like in the browser. Notice that went to the version. So I'm using npm to do the versioning. In this case, you don't have to do it that way, because I don't like too much complexity in a lot of these things, but sometimes it's easier to do it. In this case, it is for me. So we can go in here and change that to the nomodule, or I can go back to here to show you this is the HTML you put in. If you want to use this component, you pull in this script, or you pull in this script if you wanted to use on package, and then you put in your HTML. It just works. It's there. That's it. No npm install or anything. So I showed you in the demo how that works, and once you put it in on npm, it's available right away on Unpackage and on Skypack as well. So you can use either one of those. There's another alternative way, which I recommend because you get more customization at the moment. Like I said, Skypack may be handling something similar to this in the future, but if you wanted to have staging URLs specifically, you could map your Git repository to have a version. So the Git repository is version 1.0 for the branch, or 1.00, 0.00, whatever. And then you'd map a URL in your CDN to be that particular version. And then you can further do some infrastructure work to say, all right, I want to have all these components use this particular URL on staging and this particular URL on integration testing, or whatever environments you have. And that's one way to do it, where you get a lot of customization. And that's very powerful. And that's an example of how you would add tooling on top of this system to get more out of it. Not because you have to, but because it makes it easier, versus being locked into all this complexity that we talked about earlier with applications and components. All right, so easy peasy to do this. I'm going back. We can see the one thing I want to talk about too is just planning for the future. Like, now that we have these components and they're small and they're scalable, let's make our apps more modular as well. Use these micro frameworks as these components, right? You can use Lerna or other comparable projects to break apart your monolith project into smaller pieces. We can take a lot of our components and piece them into some sort of component groups, like inputs for forms or things like that. Form components, different types of layout modules, that you might make. And we can use stuff like web workers for complex state management, which Surma has talked about. He's from Google. And he's done a lot of interesting work with those. And then, like I had mentioned earlier, CLI tooling and add-ons to this process for better distribution and compression. So the main takeaways from this. All right, so ES modules with no module fallbacks. All right, so that makes it simpler. Okay, we don't have as much complexity with the tooling. We have the same browser support. It's not really improved per se, but we have a different way of doing it that's much more backwards compatible. We have simple URL versioning that's easy to do. 1, 2, 3, you're published onto a CDN. Enables extensible component design. So if you start thinking about it this way, where you have extensibility built into your components, then that future-proofs them. Okay, and we're using native APIs to do the same sort of thing, so that if you're using X framework on your application and your components are using this technique, then they're going to be future-proofed. Hey, it works in the browser, so it's going to be fine. All right, so make component distribution easy. Like I said, that's on the CDN. And you add as you go. You add, let's say you want to have a minification tool. You add that on top. You don't need to put it in, though. All right, add it because you want to, because it adds something to your process, not because it's the status quo. Okay, same thing with Webpack or anything like that. Just add it as desired. And like I said, references for this can be found. So if you go to github.com/live components, and that'll have all the repositories. It'll have the documentation, the slides. You can just screenshot this or take a pic of this and put it in. But it's this is the presentation available on Google Slides. And feel free to look through it if you have any questions, you can catch me on Twitter, or you can, ping at the web platform on Twitter as well. All right. And that's it. Thank you so much.